On June 4, 1944, the Atlantic rolled heavily under a low grey sky. Swells rose and fell around a wounded German submarine forced to the surface against its will. Depth charges had done their work, not enough to sink it, but enough to break its certainty. Smoke drifted from open hatches. The war, momentarily, had pushed a secret into daylight. The submarine was German submarine U-505, hunted relentlessly for days by an American task group centered on the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. The attack had been methodical, practiced, almost routine. This was how submarines were killed, pressure applied until steel and nerve gave way. When the U-boat finally broke the surface, it did so listing, damaged, and leaking. The crew poured out in trained haste. Men jumped into the sea with lifebelts and discipline, abandoning ship exactly as they had been taught. Their panic was controlled, almost mechanical. They believed the submarine was finished. They believed their duty was complete. From the American ships, this looked like the end of another hunt. A kill not yet claimed, but assured. Submarines surfaced only to die. What followed next was never expected. A small boarding party pushed off in a motor launch, rifles ready but held low. Their orders were cautious, not heroic: confirm the scuttling, gather what could be taken, withdraw before the boat sank. No one anticipated resistance. No one believed the submarine could be saved. German doctrine demanded destruction of secrets before surrender. Open hatches meant abandonment, and abandonment meant loss. Yet as the Americans drew closer, something felt wrong. The U-boat was still moving. Slowly, deliberately, it circled under its own power. Charges had not been set. Valves had not been opened fully. The submarine was damaged, but alive. Hatches stood open. Water rushed in and out with the swell. Inside, the boat was silent. No gunfire. No alarms. Just steel corridors waiting to flood or be entered. For a brief moment, the war hesitated. The boarding party climbed aboard without knowing what lay below: traps, survivors, or secrets that had never been captured before. Above the waterline, history paused. Below it, decisions made in the next few minutes would echo far beyond the Atlantic. And none of the men stepping onto that deck yet understood what they were about to take alive. The first American sailors climbed down into darkness, still humming with life. Inside the submarine, the air was thick with oil, sweat, and metal. The engines were warm to the touch. Gauges flickered faintly. This was not a wreck. It was a living machine, abruptly abandoned, as if its crew had stepped out for only a moment. The submarine was German submarine U-505, and nothing inside suggested it had been prepared for capture. Charts lay open on navigation tables. Logbooks were stacked neatly, pages filled with precise handwriting. Tools were where they belonged. No papers had been burned. No valves fully opened. The meticulous rituals drilled into German crews for scuttling had not been completed. This was never supposed to happen. German submariners were trained to destroy their boats completely if capture loomed. Enigma machines were to be smashed. Code books weighted and thrown overboard. The submarine itself was to be sent to the bottom, its secrets erased with it. Yet here, astonishingly, the enemy's system remained intact. The silence inside the boat felt deliberate, almost accusatory. It was the quiet of a plan interrupted mid-sentence. Every compartment told the same story: haste without completion. Panic contained just enough to fail its final obligation. The war had cracked open a door that doctrine insisted must never be left ajar. For the boarding party, understanding came slowly. What they were seeing was unprecedented. This was not intelligence gathered from wreckage or prisoners' recollections. This was the enemy as he actually operated, his machines, his records, his habits, frozen in time. For the first time in the Atlantic War, the German submarine arm had been taken whole. Shock settled into opportunity. The sailors knew enough to recognize that what lay around them was dangerous, not because it might explode, but because it must not be known to exist. Capture alone was not enough. Survival of the secret now mattered as much as survival of the ship. Above deck, the Atlantic continued its indifferent motion. Below, a different current had begun to move, one that would not remain confined to this steel hull. The enemy's mind, preserved by accident, was about to be carried ashore. And with it, the balance beneath the waves was about to shift in ways no one on that boarding party could yet measure. The orders came quickly, and they were absolute. From the moment word reached command, secrecy became the mission. What had been captured was not merely a submarine, but a vulnerability, one that could vanish the instant it was acknowledged. The directive was simple: nothing must be said to anyone who did not need to know. The survivors were separated and isolated. They were not paraded as prisoners, not questioned in groups, not allowed to compare stories. Each man was removed from the context of his crewmates, denied the chance to reconstruct what had happened. Silence, enforced early, would preserve confusion longer than force ever could. There would be no public announcement. No communiques. No photographs released to the press. Official records would show another U-boat sunk at sea, its crew lost or scattered. The fiction was deliberate and carefully maintained. Even among allies, information was rationed. Knowledge, in this moment, was a weapon best kept singular. The captured submarine was towed under guard, its existence erased as it moved. Routes were altered. Logs adjusted. The sea swallowed the truth while steel cables carried it away. To the outside world, nothing extraordinary had occurred. The Atlantic War continued as before, unaware that its rules had quietly changed. This was not deception born of pride. It was necessity. If the enemy learned that one of its boats had been taken intact, doctrine would adapt overnight. Codes would change. Procedures would tighten. The advantage would evaporate before it could be exploited. Silence, therefore, became strategic, a shield as vital as any escort. Within the United States Navy, the implications were understood immediately. Captured intact, the enemy's system could be studied without guesswork. Habits observed. Patterns confirmed. But only if the enemy remained unaware that the mirror now faced him. Thus the cold open closed, not with resolution, but with concealment. What began in violence ended in restraint. The success of the boarding would be measured not by what was taken, but by what was not revealed. Above the Atlantic, the war appeared unchanged. Beneath it, a secret moved quietly toward shore, carrying with it the promise of answers that had eluded hunters for years. And from that silence, a deeper advantage was about to emerge. Germany entered the Atlantic War with a theory of victory shaped by memory and mathematics. The surface fleet could not challenge Britain directly, but submarines did not need to. Naval doctrine centered on attrition, slow, relentless pressure applied far from land. Sink enough merchant ships, and the island would starve. Supplies would fail. Morale would follow. Victory would arrive without a decisive battle. The U-boat was the instrument of that belief. Cheap compared to battleships, numerous and difficult to counter, submarines promised efficiency over spectacle. Each patrol was measured not in survival, but in tonnage sunk. Losses were expected, even planned for. A submarine that failed to return was not a scandal, it was the cost of arithmetic. German command trusted technology to compensate for risk. Improved torpedoes, longer range, better radios, tighter coordination. Wolfpack tactics turned individual boats into a system, guided by centralized command. The ocean became something that could be managed, predicted, and exploited from afar. Complexity, it was believed, could be mastered. Morale followed from this logic. U-boat crews were told, correctly, that they were winning. Early successes reinforced the message. Convoys burned. Britain rationed. Newspapers spoke of an unseen struggle tilting steadily in Germany's favor. Each patrol felt like participation in something inevitable. The Atlantic itself was viewed as controllable space. Vast, yes, but structured. Shipping lanes could be mapped. Patterns detected. Enemy responses anticipated. Submarines did not need to dominate the sea. They only needed to remain hidden within it long enough to bleed the enemy dry. Over time, confidence hardened into assumption. Procedures became habits. Habits became doctrine. The belief that U-boats would never be taken intact was not arrogance, it was consistency reinforced by experience. Boats were sunk. Crews died. Secrets stayed buried. That was how the system worked. This faith shaped decisions at every level, from command briefings to individual scuttling drills. The idea that an enemy could board a living U-boat, untouched and intact, did not fit the model. It was not planned against because it had never happened. But systems built on assumption rarely announce their breaking point. They wait, quietly, for the one moment that does not fit the pattern. And on the surface of the Atlantic, that moment had already occurred. The U-boat war unfolded far from crowds and cameras. Unlike battles on land or in the air, defeat beneath the ocean left little evidence. Ships vanished. Radio signals went silent. Steel and men disappeared without witnesses. For Germany's leadership, the Atlantic became an invisible front, one where success and failure were filtered through reports rather than observed directly. By the time information reached Berlin, it had already been shaped. Losses were explained as sacrifice. Setbacks were reframed as temporary reverses. Commanders understood what kind of news traveled upward most easily and what stalled along the way. The further a report climbed, the cleaner it became. Ambiguity was sanded down. Doubt was removed. This culture was not accidental. Under Adolf Hitler, pessimism was treated as weakness. Confidence was rewarded. Officers learned quickly that belief mattered as much as accuracy. To question the trajectory of the U-boat campaign was to question inevitability itself, and that carried risk. As a result, feedback thinned. The system heard what it expected to hear. Sinkings confirmed doctrine. Survival bias reinforced optimism. When submarines failed to return, they were absorbed into the accepted cost of attrition. There was no clear metric for decline, only faith that the numbers still favored Germany. Submarines gradually became symbols rather than tools. They represented pressure, inevitability, and German ingenuity more than they represented fragile machines operating at the edge of endurance. The idea that the enemy might adapt faster or learn more deeply did not fit the narrative. Success was assumed to be cumulative and permanent. This quiet arrogance did not announce itself. It grew through repetition. Each successful patrol justified the last. Each confident briefing reinforced the next. The Atlantic, vast and opaque, allowed belief to substitute for verification. What could not be seen was assumed to be under control. In such an environment, the loss of a single submarine meant little. Even the capture of one, unimaginable as that seemed, would be dismissed if it went unreported. The system relied on invisibility, and invisibility bred certainty. But unseen fronts have a way of turning without warning. And when belief replaces feedback, the first sign of collapse is not resistance, it is surprise. Somewhere beyond Berlin's maps and charts, that surprise was already moving through Allied hands, unrecognized for what it would soon become. The learning curve was paid for in ships. Early Allied losses in the Atlantic were severe, especially as the United States entered the war with limited experience in anti-submarine warfare. Merchantmen burned within sight of coastlines. Convoys scattered. The sea exposed every assumption that had been carried over from peacetime doctrine. What had worked on paper failed under pressure. Adaptation followed necessity. Convoys were reorganized and tightened, no longer loose collections of ships but coordinated formations with layered protection. Radar matured from experiment to instrument, extending sight beyond darkness and weather. High-frequency direction finding narrowed uncertainty. Each improvement was incremental, but together they reduced the ocean's advantage. The most decisive change arrived with air power. Escort carriers, small, utilitarian, and numerous, pushed coverage into the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had once operated with near impunity. Aircraft no longer had to turn back before reaching the convoy's most vulnerable stretches. The sea lanes were no longer blind. With this expansion came a shift in mindset. The United States Navy moved from passive defense to active pursuit. Hunter-killer groups formed around carriers and destroyers, tasked not with guarding ships but with finding submarines. The initiative changed hands. U-boats were no longer predators alone. They were prey. Doctrine followed practice, not the other way around. Commanders were encouraged to experiment, to adjust tactics quickly, to discard what failed. Reports moved faster. Feedback loops shortened. Learning accelerated under pressure because it had to. Survival demanded it. For German crews, the change was palpable. Patrols grew more dangerous. Surfacing at night carried new risks. Radio transmissions invited swift retaliation. The Atlantic felt smaller, more crowded, less forgiving. What had once seemed like a controlled environment began to resist mastery. Belief, so carefully maintained, began to crack. Not in speeches, but in experience. The enemy was no longer static. He adapted, and faster than expected. Losses that once seemed acceptable now felt cumulative. Confidence thinned even as official assurances continued. The ocean had not changed. The rules had. And somewhere within that accelerating contest of adaptation, a captured submarine, still unknown to its builders, was about to tip the balance even further. The new phase of the Atlantic War took form around a modest escort carrier, the USS Guadalcanal. From it emerged Hunter-Killer Group 22.3, a task group built not to shield convoys, but to seek out submarines wherever they hid. This was a deliberate reversal of posture. Defense had failed to end the threat. Pursuit might. The group's mission was aggressive by design. It roamed independently, free from the fixed routes of merchant shipping. Destroyer escorts fanned outward, aircraft circled overhead, and the ocean itself became a hunting ground rather than a corridor to be endured. The goal was not to react to contact, but to provoke it, to force submarines to maneuver, transmit, and reveal themselves. Below decks, sonar operators became the quiet specialists of this new war. Hours were spent listening to a sea that spoke in echoes and distortions. Propeller beats hid behind currents. Thermal layers bent sound into false shapes. At first, much of it sounded like nothing at all. With time, that nothing acquired meaning. Skill grew through repetition. Operators learned to separate ghosts from steel, biology from machinery. A drift in contact that held rhythm too steady. A return that shifted just enough to suggest intent. The Atlantic began to acquire contours not of geography, but of behavior. The ocean was mapped by sound. As this auditory map sharpened, invisibility thinned. U-boats that once relied on silence found it unreliable. Each course change left a trace. Each depth adjustment altered an acoustic signature. The sea no longer absorbed mistakes as easily as it once had. It remembered them. Pressure mounted beneath the waves. Submarine commanders felt it in the lengthening hunts and the narrowing margins for escape. The old rhythm, attack, withdraw, vanish, gave way to exhaustion. Days were spent evading rather than striking. Batteries drained. Air grew stale. The initiative had shifted, and it showed. Hunter-Killer Group 22.3 was not unique, but it was emblematic. It represented a war that had learned how to learn. Tactics were refined between patrols. Successes were analyzed quickly. Failures were corrected without ceremony. Doctrine bent to experience, not the reverse. For the U-boat fleet, this meant something fundamental had changed. The Atlantic was no longer a space they controlled by default. It had become contested, watched, and increasingly unforgiving. The struggle had entered a phase where survival itself required constant adaptation. And in the midst of this tightening net, one encounter, still unseen by German command, was about to expose far more than a single submarine ever should have. Depth charges were designed to kill, not to preserve. Their settings reflected doctrine hardened by years of attrition: apply pressure until steel failed, then apply more. Submarines were targets to be erased, not objects to be taken. Capture was not part of the calculus. Survival of the enemy vessel was considered irrelevant, even dangerous. Yet on that day in the Atlantic, routine gave way to judgment. As contacts tightened around a damaged U-boat, depth charges were deliberately calibrated shallow, close enough to force the submarine up, but not deep enough to tear it apart. This was a calculated risk. Too little pressure, and the boat would escape. Too much, and it would sink with everything inside. Risk replaced habit in real time. Officers understood what they were doing even as they did it. If the submarine surfaced intact, it would present a problem doctrine had never prepared them to solve. Boarding an enemy submarine was considered unthinkable, dangerous, unnecessary, and explicitly discouraged. German crews were trained to rig scuttling charges. Any delay invited explosion. But opportunity rarely respects regulation. In the narrow window created by damage and confusion, something unprecedented became possible. The choice was not debated at length. There was no time. The decision emerged from instinct sharpened by experience. This boat should not be sunk yet. Within minutes, orders were adjusted. Firepower was restrained. Guns remained trained, but silent. A boarding party was assembled not because it was safe, but because it might succeed. Innovation, in this moment, outran policy. This was not recklessness. It was adaptation under pressure. The men involved understood that doctrine existed for typical conditions, and this was not one of them. The war had produced a moment that no manual had anticipated. To follow the rules blindly would mean destroying something that might never be seen again. The struggle shifted from destruction to control. From sinking a target to managing it. Every second mattered. If the Germans regained their footing, scuttling would follow. If the boat flooded unchecked, it would be lost anyway. The margin for success was measured in minutes. In choosing capture over certainty, the Americans accepted a different kind of danger, one less visible than an explosion, but far more consequential if mishandled. The Atlantic War had already demanded new tools and new tactics. Now it demanded a new kind of courage, the willingness to pause destruction long enough to extract meaning. The rules of engagement had been broken quietly, without authorization or celebration. But in that deviation, the tactical struggle evolved into something else entirely. And once that line was crossed, there would be no returning to routine. The boarding party descended into a space never meant for them. Inside the submarine, the steel hull amplified every sound, boots on ladders, water sloshing below deck, the dull groan of stressed metal. Light was scarce. Air was heavy. Somewhere beneath their feet, the Atlantic was already forcing its way in. The danger was not theoretical. German submarines were built with scuttling in mind, and the men knew it. Valves could be opened. Charges could be set. Booby traps were a real possibility. Every hatch was approached as if it might be the last thing touched. Weapons stayed ready, but caution moved first. Flooding was the immediate enemy. Seawater rushed through open valves and ruptured fittings, rising steadily in lower compartments. There were no automated systems to rely on now, only hands and judgment. Sailors spun wheels, closed vents, and improvised seals, often without knowing whether they were stopping a leak or making one worse. Time pressed from all sides. As the water was slowed, the submarine began to reveal itself. In the control room, instruments still showed depth and course. In the radio compartment, equipment sat intact, untouched by fire or sabotage. Classified machinery, encryption devices, signal logs, operational charts was gathered methodically, passed hand to hand toward the hatch. Each item secured represented a fragment of an enemy system rarely seen whole. The work was relentless. Sweat mixed with oil. The boat rolled with the swell, threatening to undo every repair with each shift of weight. There was no clear sense of progress, only resistance overcome inch by inch. The submarine seemed to fight back even in defeat, asserting its design through inertia and mass. Every compartment told a story. Bunks still warm. Coffee cups braced against bulkheads. Tools laid out mid-task. This was not a wreck frozen by violence, but a machine interrupted mid-operation. The presence of life lingered everywhere, making the act of capture feel less like victory and more like intrusion. The hull resisted. Systems failed unexpectedly. Pumps lost power. Valves refused to turn. Each solved problem revealed another beneath it. The submarine did not surrender easily. It demanded effort for every foot reclaimed from the sea. Persistence prevailed not through brilliance, but through endurance. The boarding party adapted constantly, learning the boat as they moved through it. What could not be fixed was bypassed. What could not be saved was abandoned. The objective narrowed to what mattered most: keep the submarine afloat long enough to take everything of value. When they finally emerged, exhausted and soaked, the significance of what had been accomplished had not yet settled in. They had not merely boarded an enemy submarine. They had taken control of it, against doctrine, against time, and against the Atlantic itself. Below the waterline, the struggle had ended. Above it, the consequences were only beginning to surface. What the boarding party recovered was not dramatic in appearance. There were no experimental weapons, no exotic devices humming with menace. Instead, the most consequential items were paper, dials, and routines, ordinary objects whose power lay in what they represented. Code books were lifted from compartments where they had been kept within arm's reach, not destroyed, not weighted, not thrown into the sea. They were intact. An Enigma machine sat idle, its rotors locked in their last position, as if waiting for a message that would never arrive. This was the heart of German naval communication, the system that allowed wolf packs to coordinate across hundreds of miles of ocean. It had been designed to be destroyed before capture. That it remained whole was not oversight, it was interruption. Tactical manuals told a quieter story. They outlined expectations of Allied behavior that no longer matched reality. Assumptions about convoy responses, air coverage limits, and search persistence were written with confidence that had not been revised. The enemy was still being fought as he had been, not as he had become. Fuel logs exposed another truth. Calculations were tight. Margins were thin. Patrol endurance was measured carefully, revealing how close many boats were operating to their limits. The image of endless, patient hunters gave way to something more fragile: machines and men stretched by distance, weather, and growing pressure. Together, these materials formed a complete picture. Not just of how U-boats operated, but of how German command believed the war at sea was unfolding. Confidence appeared not only misplaced, but outdated. The Atlantic was being understood through assumptions that no longer held. For Allied intelligence, this was revelation without conjecture. Patterns could now be confirmed rather than guessed. Decisions once made on probability could be anchored in certainty. Routes, timings, and behaviors emerged from the fog of war with unsettling clarity. This was not a single breakthrough. It was a framework. The enemy's system, its rhythms, its blind spots, its limits, had been exposed intact. Years of speculation collapsed into understanding in the space of a single recovery. The turning point did not arrive with an explosion or a sinking. It arrived quietly, sealed in documents passed hand to hand, catalogued and guarded under layers of secrecy. The submarine itself mattered less than what it carried. What the Germans had left behind was not merely intelligence. It was the realization that their war beneath the waves was no longer hidden. And once secrecy was lost, inevitability followed. The documents told a story Germany had been telling itself for too long. Patrol logs recovered from the submarine revealed success claims that strained credibility when read alongside Allied records. Sinkings were reported with confidence, sometimes certainty, even when no corresponding loss could be confirmed. Damage was assumed to be fatal. Ambiguity was recorded as victory. Losses, by contrast, faded quickly from the page. Boats that failed to return were listed without detail, absorbed into acceptable attrition. There was no systematic reckoning, no mechanism to reconcile expectation with outcome. The numbers moved in one direction, regardless of reality beneath the waves. From these reports, German command believed the war at sea remained recoverable. Setbacks were temporary. Pressure could still be reapplied. The system, they thought, had bent but not broken. Faith filled the gaps left by incomplete information, and confidence persisted long after conditions had changed. But the reality exposed by the captured records was starkly different. The Atlantic had already shifted. Allied adaptation had narrowed margins beyond sustainability. Patrols lasted longer for fewer results. Encounters ended increasingly in evasion rather than attack. The sea was no longer permissive, it was hostile. Germany was fighting a remembered war, not the one unfolding. Its assumptions were anchored in earlier successes, replayed and reinforced through reports that echoed past triumphs. The enemy described in those pages was slower, less capable, and less coordinated than the one now in operation. Doctrine lagged behind experience, and experience was filtered before it could correct belief. This divergence mattered more than any single tactical failure. It meant decisions were being made on a foundation that no longer existed. Resources were allocated to strategies already countered. Crews were sent into waters that had become traps. Confidence, once earned, had become inertia. The illusion did not collapse all at once. It thinned, quietly, as evidence accumulated beyond denial. But by the time the truth could no longer be ignored, the advantage it concealed had already been exploited by the enemy. Beneath the waves, the lie had sustained the campaign longer than it deserved. Once exposed, it revealed not just miscalculation, but vulnerability. And vulnerability, in war, is rarely forgiven twice. Silence was not an afterthought. It was the strategy. The moment the submarine was taken intact, Allied commanders understood that publicity would destroy its value instantly. If German command learned that a U-boat had been captured whole, its codes, procedures, and machines seized, the response would be automatic. Encryption systems would change. Operating habits would tighten. The window would close before it ever fully opened. At the center of that danger stood Enigma. Its strength did not rest solely on mathematics or machinery, but on belief that it was secure, that compromise was impossible, that no enemy could see through it in real time. That belief was fragile. Once broken, the system would be abandoned without hesitation. So the capture remained classified at the highest levels. There were no announcements, no commendations, no press releases. To the world, the submarine was listed as sunk. To its own navy, it had simply failed to return. Silence preserved ignorance, and ignorance preserved continuity. That continuity was everything. Because German Naval Command did not know the system was exposed, it did not change it. Codebooks stayed in circulation. Procedures remained intact. Message formats persisted day after day, week after week. U-boats sailed into the Atlantic believing they were unseen, unheard, unread. Meanwhile, Allied code breakers worked in rooms far removed from the sea, exploiting what silence had bought them. Messages that once required days to interpret were read quickly. Convoy routes were adjusted before submarines arrived. Hunter-killer groups were positioned with foresight rather than reaction. Intelligence replaced chance. The advantage compounded quietly. One decrypted message led to a successful interception. That success reinforced confidence in the intelligence. Confidence encouraged reliance. Reliance produced more success. All of it rested on the same fragile foundation, the enemy's certainty that nothing had gone wrong. U-boat crews felt the change without understanding it. Patrols were met more often. Evasions failed more quickly. The ocean seemed hostile in ways that defied explanation. To them, it felt like bad luck. To command, it appeared temporary. To Allied intelligence, it was confirmation. This was the climax of the story, though it lacked drama. No single battle announced it. No decisive sinking marked the moment. The war beneath the waves turned on something far less visible, the preservation of a secret. Silence ensured that the enemy continued to trust a system that had already betrayed him. And in war, there is no greater advantage than an opponent who does not know he has already lost ground. The capture mattered not because it happened, but because no one was allowed to know that it had. The war at sea went on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. German submarines continued to sail from their pens, crews carrying out routines perfected over years of conflict. Orders were received, patrol zones assigned, expectations reinforced. To those aboard, the Atlantic remained dangerous, but familiar. There was no warning that the rules beneath the waves had quietly changed. They sailed into traps they could not see. Convoys altered course hours before contact. Air patrols arrived with improbable precision. Hunter-killer groups appeared where chance alone should not have placed them. Encounters ended faster, more decisively. What once felt like misfortune began to feel like pattern, though no one could name it. Convoy losses declined steadily. Not dramatically enough to provoke immediate alarm, but consistently enough to matter. Shipping lanes grew safer week by week. Tonnage charts bent downward. Britain breathed easier. The change was cumulative, built from dozens of small decisions informed by intelligence that never announced its source. For U-boat crews, the experience was disorienting. They followed doctrine faithfully and were punished for it. Silence no longer guaranteed safety. Evasion no longer ensured escape. The sea felt crowded, watchful, and increasingly hostile. Yet nothing in their briefings explained why. There was no enemy breakthrough to point to, only a growing sense that luck had turned against them. German command searched for explanations that fit existing belief. Weather, improved enemy training, temporary concentration of forces. The possibility that their communications were compromised did not rise easily to the surface. Enigma remained trusted. Procedures remained unchanged. The system continued to feed itself assumptions that no longer held. Victory for the Allies arrived statistically, not symbolically. There was no single engagement that marked the end of the U-boat threat. No moment of public realization. Instead, ships arrived more often than they failed to. Losses became manageable. Production outpaced destruction. The Atlantic ceased to be a crisis without ever declaring itself solved. The capture that had made this possible remained a ghost event. Officially, it had never happened. No memorial marked it. No date commemorated it. Its influence was felt only in outcomes, routes taken, lives spared, tonnage delivered safely to shore. Consequence unfolded invisibly. The war continued, but on terms no longer set by those who believed they controlled the sea. The enemy fought on with conviction, unaware that his advantage had already been eroded by a moment of silence he would never be told about. And in that unknowing persistence lay the quiet finality of the Atlantic struggle. The capture revealed more than codes and machinery. It exposed a pattern of belief that had quietly outlived its usefulness. Germany was fighting a war built on assumptions forged years earlier, when the Atlantic was permissive, when opponents were uncoordinated, when attrition favored the hunter. Those conditions had expired, but the beliefs attached to them endured. Hardware had not failed first. The submarines were still capable machines. Their torpedoes still worked. Their crews were still disciplined and brave. What failed was interpretation. Signals were misread. Trends were smoothed over. Decline was explained away rather than confronted. Intelligence failure proved more dangerous than any technical shortcoming. Faith replaced measurement. Reports reinforced expectation instead of challenging it. Success was assumed where ambiguity existed. Losses were accepted as cost rather than examined as warning. The system no longer corrected itself. It confirmed itself. And confirmation, repeated often enough, hardened into certainty. The capture mattered because it interrupted that cycle on one side only. Allied commanders chose secrecy not as an act of deception alone, but as a means of preservation. By withholding the truth, they protected the enemy's belief system long enough to exploit it. Silence became an instrument, allowing German command to continue trusting a framework already broken. Truth, meanwhile, favored adaptability. Allied intelligence did not cling to earlier assumptions about the enemy. It revised them constantly. New data altered behavior. Mistakes were corrected quickly. Learning became institutional rather than personal. This asymmetry, one side revising belief, the other defending it, widened with each patrol. The moral gap grew alongside the operational one. Not between right and wrong, but between flexibility and rigidity. One system accepted uncertainty and adjusted. The other resisted it, seeking comfort in precedent. Over time, the difference proved decisive. What the capture ultimately revealed was that wars are not lost when weapons fail, but when understanding does. When belief becomes insulated from evidence, even strong machines are rendered fragile. When secrecy preserves illusion on one side and clarity on the other, outcomes follow with quiet inevitability. Reflection deepens here, away from the drama of boarding parties and depth charges. The moment mattered not because of what was taken, but because of what was allowed to continue unchanged on the other side. The enemy was not defeated immediately. He was allowed to persist, unaware that his foundation had already been undermined. And in war, persistence built on false belief is not resilience. It is delay before collapse. The submarine survived the war. Not as a wreck on the ocean floor, not as a memory reduced to coordinates and dates, but as steel held together long enough to be understood. German submarine U-505 endured because it was captured alive, because destruction paused just long enough for truth to surface. Its hull preserved a moment of belief. Inside its compartments were not just machines and documents, but assumptions made solid. Charts reflected confidence in patterns that no longer existed. Logs recorded victories already outdated by the time they were written. Procedures assumed an enemy still learning, not one that had already adapted. The submarine became a time capsule of certainty. The capture rewrote Atlantic history without announcing itself. No public turning point followed. No declaration marked the shift. Instead, intelligence flowed quietly into planning rooms, altering routes, timings, and priorities. Decisions made in silence reshaped outcomes at sea. The war moved forward on a different axis, invisible to those who believed it unchanged. No medals could match its impact. There was no ribbon for preserving secrecy, no citation for allowing the enemy to persist in error. The boarding party returned to duty. Commanders moved on to the next problem. The submarine itself was hidden away, its existence denied while its contents were used relentlessly. What it carried was not merely codebooks or machines. The real cargo was confidence, the enemy's belief in the war he thought he was fighting. That belief traveled intact from the Atlantic to Allied intelligence desks, where it could be examined, measured, and quietly dismantled. Once revealed, it could not be restored. Germany could replace submarines. It could train new crews. It could build better weapons. But it could not easily recover trust in a system it did not know had failed. The damage was not to steel, but to understanding. And that kind of damage compounds. The Atlantic War did not end because the enemy lost courage. It ended because he lost accuracy. He fought on, convinced his assumptions still held, while the sea answered him with increasing clarity. Each patrol confirmed the illusion for command and refuted it in practice. The contradiction widened until endurance replaced expectation. The submarine's legacy rests not in its survival, but in what it exposed. It showed that belief, when insulated from evidence, becomes vulnerability. That secrecy, when paired with adaptability, becomes decisive. And that sometimes the most powerful act in war is not destruction, but restraint applied at precisely the right moment. They took a submarine alive. And in doing so, they discovered the war Hitler believed he was still winning, already slipping quietly out of reach.